Welcome back to Nightmare Theatre. Arthur Pembroke here. Thanks again for joining me tonight. I spent a lot of time travelling in the car with my children, and to pass the time, I'd often make up scary stories to tell them. Tonight, I'll be telling one of their favourite stories. It's about a prison guard who works late nights at an insane asylum and their newest patient, Margaret. I'll warn you, the story will leave off on a bit of a cliffhanger. Since this is meant to be an anthology series, let me know down in the comment if you want to hear more. She wasn't human, and now I know why. My name's Brian, and for the past 3 years I've been working the night shift as a security guard at Hollowbrook Mental Hospital. It's a quiet place out in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place you only find when you're looking for it, tucked away in the woods, miles from the nearest town. Most nights nothing much happens, just the usual rounds, checking on patients, making sure doors stay locked and keeping an eye on the cameras. But last night was different. I was about halfway through my shift when they brought her in. The sound of a rattling gurney echoed through the long, sterile hallway. At first I thought it was just another routine admission. We got our fair share of troubled souls in here, people with all sorts of problems ranging from schizophrenia to full-blown psychosis. But when I saw her, I knew this was something else entirely. Her name was Margaret. 2 orderlies were struggling to wheel her through the doors of the isolation ward. She was thrashing wildly, hands and feet strapped down to the gurney with thick leather restraints. Her long black hair hung in clumps, covering most of her pale face. And her eyes, God, I'll never forget her eyes. Black, as if the pupils had swallowed up the rest, leaving nothing but an endless void. They say the eyes are windows to the soul. Well, if that's true, Margaret didn't have one. She was screaming, not words, not even coherent sounds, just this guttural, inhuman noise like a wounded animal. I've heard people scream before. I've heard patients cry out in fear, pain and rage. But this was different. It sent chills down my spine, made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to avoid staring as the orderlies pushed her past me, but it was hard not to. Her body convulsed against the restraints, and every time she moved, I could hear the sickening sound of her bones creaking, as though her joints were twisted in ways they weren't supposed to be. One of the orderlies, a guy named Kevin, caught my eye as they passed. He looked pale, his face drawn with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. He gave me a tight nod like he was saying, "Yeah, this one's bad." Once they had her in the isolation room, they locked her down tight. I watched on the monitor as they strapped her to the bed, double-checking the restraints. She didn't stop thrashing the entire time, her body jerking in unnatural spasms, her black eyes darting around the room like she was searching for something or someone. And then, just like that, she went still. It was like someone had flipped a switch. One moment, she was fighting like a wild animal, and the next, she was perfectly calm, lying there with her head tilted to one side, staring at the camera. Staring directly at me. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. There was no way she could see me. The camera was mounted in the far corner of the room, high above her head. But those eyes, it was like she knew I was watching, like she could feel my presence through the screen. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my rounds. I had other patients to check on, doors to secure, paperwork to complete, but no matter what I did, I couldn't get her out of my mind. Her face lingered in my thoughts, her empty black eyes boring into me, and that scream, it echoed in my ears long after it had stopped. By the time my rounds were done, it was nearly 2 a.m. I sat back down at the security desk, my eyes flicking to the monitors. Most of the patients were asleep, their rooms dark and quiet, but Margaret's room, that was different. She was still awake, still staring at the camera. My heart thumped in my chest as I watched her. She hadn't moved a muscle, her body lying rigid on the bed, her eyes fixed on the lens like she was waiting for something. For a long time, neither of us moved, Me in the dimly lit security room, her in the cold, sterile isolation ward. I couldn't look away. It was like her gaze had me pinned in place, and then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was a slow, creeping thing that spread across her face like a crack in the foundation of a house. Her lips parted, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, too jagged. My stomach twisted in knots as I watched her, my hands gripping the arms of my chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. Suddenly the lights in her room flickered. Just for a second, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. The hospital's power was old, the wiring prone to the occasional glitch, but this felt different. The air in the room seemed to change, the temperature dropping noticeably, even from where I sat behind the monitor. Then the lights went out, the screen went black. I sat frozen for a moment, my mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. I reached for the radio on my belt, but before I could call for maintenance, the screen flickered back to life. And Margaret, she was gone. The restraints were still there, the bed still neatly made, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with the radio, my fingers shaking as I tried to contact the other guards. "Kevin, you there? Margaret's gone. She's out of her room." No response. I checked the other cameras, scanning the hallways, the common areas. Nothing. It was like she had vanished into thin air. I cursed under my breath, grabbing my flashlight and heading toward the isolation ward. I moved quickly but cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified by the silence of the night. When I reached her room, I paused outside the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what might be waiting for me on the other side, but I had to. It was my job. Slowly, I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as it swung inward. The room was empty, just as I had seen on the monitor. The restraints were still neatly fastened to the bed, the sheets undisturbed. But Margaret was nowhere to be found. My pulse raced as I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around the room. The light caught something on the floor near the far corner, and I crouched down to get a better look. It was blood. A thin trail of it, leading from the foot of the bed to the small vent in the wall. My stomach churned as I realized what had happened. She had squeezed through the vent. Somehow she had contorted her body and slipped through the small metal grate. It didn't seem possible, but the blood was proof enough. I backed out of the room, my mind racing. I had to find her. I had to get her back into that room before something terrible happened, before she found someone else. After Margaret disappeared, things changed. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake, like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The hospital felt different too, darker, colder, even though the lights were on and everything appeared normal. But it wasn't normal, not anymore. I spent the rest of that night searching for Margaret, checking every camera, every hallway, every room. But she was gone. And not just gone, vanished like she had never been there in the first place. It didn't make sense. No one could just disappear like that, especially not someone strapped down to a bed. But the blood told a different story. The next morning when my shift ended, I filed a report. The doctors took it seriously, of course. A missing patient, especially one as dangerous as Margaret, was a big deal. But they didn't seem as worried as I was. They told me they'd handle it, whatever that meant, and advised me to take the next night off. They said I looked tired, and maybe I did. Maybe it was just the stress getting to me. But deep down, I knew something else was wrong. I should have listened to them. I should have stayed home. But I didn't. I came back. The following night, I was back at the hospital, patrolling the same hallways, checking the same rooms, but everything felt off. Every noise seemed louder. Every shadow seemed darker. Every empty room felt less empty. By midnight, the hospital was dead silent. Most of the patients were asleep, and the staff had all gone home, leaving me and a skeleton crew behind. Kevin was on duty again, along with a few nurses, but otherwise it was just me. The other guards were stationed in different parts of the building, and I was alone in the isolation ward. That's when it started. It was a little past 1 a.m. when I first heard it, the sound of something scratching inside the walls. At first I thought it was a rat, or maybe the wind. The building was old, and it wasn't uncommon for strange noises to echo through the halls late at night. But this was different. The scratching wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like someone or something was deliberately dragging their nails along the inside of the walls. I froze, listening. The sound was faint at first, barely audible, but it was getting closer, slowly, methodically. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the pipes were acting up. Maybe it was just the building settling, but my gut told me otherwise. I checked the cameras again, scanning through the different feeds, but everything looked normal. And then I saw it. Margaret. She was standing in one of the hallways, her back to the camera, her long black hair hanging down over her pale shoulders. She wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still. I couldn't tell how she had gotten there or where she had come from. The hallway was supposed to be empty. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my radio, frantically calling for Kevin. "Kevin, do you copy? Margaret's in the east hallway. We need to lock it down." Silence. I tried again. "Kevin, do you hear me?" Nothing. Panic surged through me as I stared at the monitor. Margaret hadn't moved. She was still standing there, but something was different. Her head was tilted slightly now, as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I had to find Kevin. I couldn't deal with this alone. I bolted out of the security office, racing down the hall toward the east wing. The sound of my boots hitting the tiled floor echoed off the walls, mixing with the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The hospital seemed to stretch out in front of me, the corridors growing longer with every step. When I reached the east hallway, Margaret was gone. I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding in my ears. There was no sign of her, no blood, no footprints, nothing. The hallway was as empty as it had been an hour ago. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and checked the nearby rooms. Each one was locked tight, the patients inside sleeping peacefully, except one. I approached the door at the end of the hall, my pulse quickening as I reached for the handle. The door wasn't locked. It creaked open, slowly, revealing a dark room beyond. The lights inside were flickering, casting long shadows across the floor. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was Margaret. She wasn't moving. She wasn't thrashing. She wasn't screaming. She just stood there, staring at the wall, her long black hair hanging down over her face, her pale skin glowing in the dim light. "Margaret," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't respond. I stepped into the room, my heart racing. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of something foul, like rotting meat. I gagged, covering my mouth with my hand as I approached her. "Margaret," I said again, louder this time. Still no response. I reached out, hesitantly placing a hand on her shoulder. Her skin was cold, too cold, like touching something dead. I shuddered, pulling my hand back, and that's when she moved. She turned slowly, her black eyes locking onto mine. Her face was twisted into a grotesque smile, her lips pulled back to reveal jagged, broken teeth. My blood ran cold as she took a step toward me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled for the door. My hand fumbled for the radio at my side, but before I could call for help, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. Margaret's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "You're not leaving?" I froze, my hand hovering over the radio. Her voice was low, guttural, nothing like the screams from before. It sounded inhuman. "You're not leaving?" she repeated, taking another step forward. I backed up, my heart racing. "Margaret, stay back!" I warned, my voice shaking, but she didn't listen. She just kept coming, her eyes locked on mine, that horrible smile never fading. I don't know what happened next. I don't remember running, but somehow I ended up back in the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands trembling. The door to the room was wide open, the lights flickering. Margaret was gone. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I couldn't. How could I explain something like that? No one would believe me. The doctors, the other guards, they'd think I was crazy, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I saw. I knew what happened. And I knew Margaret was still out there, somewhere, waiting. I didn't come back to the hospital for a week after that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret standing there in that room, her eyes boring into me. That grotesque smile seared into my mind. My supervisor gave me some time off, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. If only he knew the half of it. When I finally returned, the hospital felt different. It wasn't just the atmosphere or the cold dread that seemed to hang over every hallway. It was the staff, the nurses, the other guards, even the doctors. They all seemed on edge, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. No one said it outright, but I could feel it in the way they moved, the way they avoided eye contact. Something had shifted. They'd closed off the east wing. No one told me why, but I didn't need to ask. I already knew. Margaret. Whatever happened that night wasn't over. She was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone else knew more than they were letting on. The whispers, the way people avoided certain parts of the building. There was something they weren't telling me, but I wasn't going to ask. Part of me didn't want to know. The first night back, I did my rounds like usual, trying to pretend everything was normal. But nothing about it felt normal anymore. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Every creak in the walls made my skin crawl. And worst of all was the silence. The hospital, usually filled with the constant noise of patients, felt eerily quiet, like something was waiting to pounce the moment I let my guard down. By 2 a.m., I was back in the security office watching the monitors. The east wing was still dark, the cameras in that section turned off. My heart raced every time I glanced at it, half expecting to see Margaret standing in one of those blacked-out corridors. But she wasn't. Not yet. Suddenly the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Brian, you there?" It was Kevin, his voice tense. "Yeah, I'm here," I replied, my hand hovering over the screen where the east wing used to be. "What's going on?" "There's something you need to see. Come to the west wing, room 312. Room 312? My stomach turned. That was one of the isolation rooms. I didn't like the sound of this, but Kevin wouldn't call me unless it was serious. "I'm on my way," I said, grabbing my flashlight and heading out of the office. The hallways were dead silent as I made my way to the west wing. My footsteps echoed off the cold tile floors, the flickering lights overhead casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. It felt like something was following me, watching me from just out of sight. When I reached room 312, Kevin was standing outside the door, his face pale and drawn. He glanced at me, then back at the door like he was afraid to go in. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Kevin didn't answer right away. He just stared at the door for a moment, his hands trembling slightly. Something's wrong. You need to see it for yourself." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the small, dimly lit room beyond. At first glance, it looked like any other isolation room, bare walls, a bed bolted to the floor, a small window. But then I saw the writing, It covered every inch of the wall, scrawled in jagged, frantic letters, as if someone had scratched it into the paint with their bare hands. She's in the walls, she's watching, she knows, she knows. My blood ran cold as I stepped closer, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The words were written over and over again, growing more frantic, more desperate the farther I looked. And at the center of it all, in the middle of the room, was a single, blood-stained handprint. I stepped back, my heart racing. Who did this? Kevin shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. The patient. He was one of the quiet ones, never caused any trouble. Then, last night, he just snapped, started screaming about a woman with black hair, pale skin, and black eyes. I felt my stomach drop. Margaret. He kept saying she was inside the walls, that she was watching him, waiting for him. We had to sedate him, but even then he wouldn't stop talking about her. I stared at the writing on the walls, my mind racing. It wasn't possible. Margaret was gone. She couldn't still be here. But deep down I knew better. This was her doing. She was toying with us, with me, and this was just the beginning. That night I couldn't stop thinking about room 312, about the handprint, the writing, the way the patient had described Margaret. It was too much of a coincidence. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still here, lurking just out of sight, watching me. Around 3 a.m., as I was patrolling the halls, the lights began to flicker. At first it was just a few, but soon the entire floor was plunged into darkness, leaving only the dim emergency lights to guide me. I reached for my radio, but before I could say anything, I heard it. A whisper. Low, faint, like a breath against the back of my neck. "Brian!" I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was no one there. My pulse quickened as I scanned the empty hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Brian!" The voice was closer now, almost in my ear. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw her. Margaret. Standing at the end of the hall, her long black hair hanging down over her face, her pale skin glowing in the dim light. Her black eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. Her lips curled into that same twisted smile. "Margaret," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me, her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Suddenly the lights flickered back on, and Margaret was gone. I ran back to the security office, my hands trembling as I slammed the door behind me. The monitors flickered to life, the cameras showing nothing but empty hallways, empty rooms. But I knew better. Margaret was still here, and she wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't stop shaking. After Margaret appeared in the hallway, I was certain of one thing: this wasn't in my head. She was real. She was here, and she was playing with me. But what I didn't understand was why. What did she want, and why was she fixated on me? For the rest of the night, I stayed in the security office, my eyes glued to the monitors, jumping at every little noise. The usual hum of the hospital's machinery seemed louder now, more oppressive. Every shadow felt alive, creeping at the edges of my vision, teasing me with glimpses of movement where there shouldn't have been any. Around 4 a.m, Kevin came by to check on me. He looked rough, pale, sweating. His eyes darted around nervously, and I knew he'd seen something too. "You good?" he asked, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Not even close," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "Have you seen her?" Kevin hesitated, his face growing even more pale. "I don't know what I saw, but something's not right, man. The staff's been talking. There are whispers going around about Margaret." I leaned forward. "What are they saying?" Kevin glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure we weren't being watched, then lowered his voice. "They're saying she's not just some patient. Some of the older staff, they claim she's been here before, decades ago. Same name, same appearance, same everything." I stared at him in disbelief. That's impossible. People don't just show up like that. I know, but the nurses, they swear by it. They say Margaret's something else, something worse than we've ever dealt with before, and ever since she showed up, things have been happening. My heart sank. I didn't need convincing. Margaret wasn't human. Not anymore. Before Kevin could say more, the power flickered again. The lights above us buzzed, dimming, then flared back to life. Kevin and I exchanged a glance. "She's messing with us," I muttered, standing up from my chair. "She's playing some kind of game." "Maybe we shouldn't," Kevin started, but he stopped when the radio on my desk crackled to life. It was a whisper, barely audible, but there. "Brian, come to me." My blood turned to ice. It was Margaret's voice. Kevin backed away from the desk, shaking his head. "No, man, I'm not doing this. We need to get out of here." But I couldn't move. The voice was hypnotic, luring me in like a predator to its prey. I grabbed the radio, my fingers trembling, and replied, "Where?" "East Wing, room 101. The East Wing, the one they'd closed off." My heart hammered in my chest. I knew going there was a mistake, but I couldn't stop myself. Something was drawing me in, something far darker than I could comprehend. "Brian, don't!" Kevin pleaded. "You can't go in there." I ignored him, grabbed my flashlight, and headed for the East Wing. The hallway leading to the closed section was dark, colder than the rest of the hospital. As I approached the locked doors, my breath fogged in front of me, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The door wasn't locked anymore. It creaked open with the slightest push, revealing a long corridor shrouded in darkness. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, the beam barely cutting through the thick gloom. The deeper I went, the worse the smell became. Rotting, decaying, like something long dead was lurking in the walls. My footsteps echoed off the tiled floor, the only sound in the suffocating silence. At the end of the hall was room 101. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. I hesitated, staring at the crack of darkness beyond, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but something compelled me forward. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was pitch black. The flashlight beam flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. And in the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was Margaret. Her black hair hung down her back, her pale skin glowing in the darkness. But it was her eyes, those empty black pits, that froze me in place. They seemed to swallow the light, drawing me into their void. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered, her voice like nails on glass. "You've come so far, but there's so much further to go." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, my body rooted to the spot. She took a step closer, her smile widening into something inhuman, her lips stretching far beyond what was possible. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "Now, you can never leave." Suddenly the walls began to shift. The shadows twisted and writhed, growing thicker, darker, until they took shape. Figures emerged from the darkness, faceless humanoid forms that oozed from the walls like living shadows. They closed in around me, their whispers filling the room, their cold, bony hands reaching for me. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight as the darkness closed in, suffocating me. The shadows tugged at my clothes, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, pulling me deeper into the void. "No!" I gasped, trying to pull free, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, too many. They dragged me to the floor, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. In the center of it all stood Margaret, her black eyes gleaming with triumph. "You belong to me now," she whispered, her voice echoing through the darkness, "and I will never let you go." The last thing I saw before the shadows consumed me was her smile, wide, twisted, and full of malice. Then everything went black. Thank you for joining me tonight. I sincerely appreciate it. These original stories take a bit more time, so I hope you enjoy them. Please remember to like and subscribe. I appreciate each of you, and I'll see you again tomorrow night.